So yeah, I was going to ask you if you can describe the purpose of your new benchmarking study and what it was meant to convey.
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you for that question. So the CFIA Seed Section commissioned this benchmarking study, and it was commissioned on behalf of the Seed Regulation Modernization Working Group, that they wanted essentially a benchmarking of seed systems in other countries. So the purpose of the study was really to provide an overview of the seed systems in other countries, and really to provide an information base to facilitate dialogue back within the Seed Regulatory Modernization Working Group. So that was the purpose of the study.
Now, the study shows that in most cases, the seed value chain in those countries that you studied is responsible for the coordination of the seed system. Can you mention what 6 countries you looked at and what unique benefits that results in your opinion, having the value chain in that sort of a role?
Sure. So the countries we looked at, these were identified by the seed section. So they included, outside of Canada, they included the Netherlands, then New Zealand, then the United Kingdom, the United States, and Uruguay. Those were the seed systems. So most of the focus was on the ones outside of Canada. So starting with the Netherlands has a very interesting seed system in that the seed system and certification labeling was really developed by industry in the early 1900s. So on the field crop side, it was a group called NAK, N-A-K. And so they essentially developed the whole seed certification system to facilitate exports. Then when the Netherlands joined the common market in the 1960s to comply with the regulations and requirements within the broader European community, government needed to be involved in the seed system. So they then ended up providing the necessary oversight. But the actual seed system, the need for seed certification, the regulations, the requirements, they were driven by the industry body called NAK, and they have representation across the whole seed value chain. So what's of interest there, that the body NAK, when they identify some changes are required, they essentially go through a consensus building exercise. And then as long as the changes are in compliance with international codes, or such as the OECD seed standards, they essentially inform the Dutch government that this is the way we're going, and whatever legislation or regulation needs to be changed is done. So it's a fairly flexible system. So I call that, an industry-led, government-enabled system. So when we move to New Zealand, right now is governed, not governed, but essentially the body is the New Zealand Seed Authority. That body essentially, again, has representation from all segments of the seed value chain. They essentially, again, by consensus, because they have everyone from the seed value chain, if changes are required, they implement them. And then at least for those where seed certification is required, they make sure that, of course, that any change is in compliance with the OECD seed standards or seed scheme, and as well the IOSCA standards that some countries use as well. But I should say that countries such as New Zealand, a portion of their exports are outside of the certified seed system, and it's called common seed in most countries. And those are then driven by their own internal quality assurance systems. So then if we move to the United Kingdom is is following what the Netherlands has in terms of the overall design, because they were part of the EU. So it's the EU requirements that drove their system. And it's an industry body called NIAB, the National Institute for Agricultural Botany, is essentially the coordinating body, and they have representation from all parts of the seed value chain. And again, they're the industry decision-making body with regard to seed certification or any changes required in the seed system. So again, it's a fairly flexible system. So the NIAB used to be a government organization, because NIAB in the early 1900s actually, started seed certification when it was a government agency, but they were privatized, and so now it's a private sector running that part of the business. If we go then to the United States, there's federal seed law, but then a lot of it is delivered at the state level. And the coordinating body, the way I look at it, is called AOSCA, which is a standard setting body within the United States. And so then at the state level, seed certification is driven at the state level, whether by a state government, such as in North Dakota, or a farmer organization, such as a Crop Improvement Association in Minnesota, or like in Oregon, it's the state university, the plant science department that essentially runs the seed certification system. So in the United States, it's because it's state driven, it's quite flexible in terms of how they choose to deliver seed certification, as long as it's in compliance with federal seed law. And if they're exporting product to countries that require certified seed, they live within those requirements. Excuse me. And the last country we looked at was Uruguay. Uruguay is what I call an emerging seed exporter. The Uruguayan government created a body called INASA, the National Institute for Seed, and that was developed purposefully to develop the seed industry in Uruguay. So they're focused on counter-seasonal or contra-seasonal trade, which means essentially providing seed to the northern hemisphere, so that from a multiplication point of view. Again, all of the changes required in the industry are by this body, INASE, and they are driven again by industry, because all segments of the industry are represented within that body. And what's of interest is that in Uruguay, that if change is required, they send that to the government, and essentially the government has a certain time period for implementing that change, unless they object to it. So that I think it's like within 90 days that they have to implement the change, which is provides a lot of flexibility and responsiveness in their system.
We're having this discussion in Canada about Seeds Canada has an idea for an independent standard-setting body, or an ISSB. We just had the CSGA meeting down the street. CSGA is aspiring to take on greater authority for the seed certification system in Canada. And so Seeds Canada is often talking about, we don't want a single stakeholder group in charge of something that important. And so they want to form this ISSB, a standard-setting body that's made up of many different industry groups. If we did have one single stakeholder group in charge of seed certification, what could be some potential challenges in having that one single stakeholder group in charge of that?
Well, based on the review that I did of the seed systems in other countries, I guess I would answer the question the following way: that those seed systems that essentially had one body governing the design of the seed system was represented by groups across the whole stakeholder value chain, including from plant breeders to seed growers to exporters, to everyone in the seed into the value chain. So that, for example, Uruguay, the body that was created, INSA, ASE, has that forum. The New Zealand Seed Authority has that forum. The body in the Netherlands, NAK, has that forum. And the one in the UK, NIAB, has that makeup of representing the whole value chain. So I would answer it that, as we go forward, that single body should be representative of the whole value chain, so that all interests are there, and there can be essentially a consensus view, for the good of the industry, versus a body that only represents one part of the industry. That's the way I would look at it.
The ability to change regulations and standards varies around the world, but the highly rated seed systems respond quickly based on industry consensus. Why are these seed systems able to respond so fast?
Well, they're able to respond so fast for two reasons. One is that when change is desired, it goes through a consensus-seeking body, like the bodies that I just referred to, such as, let's say, the INASE in the Uruguay or NAK in the Netherlands. So that's the first part. Or the New Zealand Seed Authority, is representation from the whole industry consensus. But secondly, it's then going back to government in the sense that, for example, in Uruguay, a change is recommended. The government has a fixed time period, that to implement. If not, it's implemented by definition. Or other times, it's again like in New Zealand. Essentially, the change is adopted because it comes from industry. But other countries, there are just more what I call regulatory requirements that they need to go through to implement change. Like even in the UK, there's a fixed time period, for change to occur. So I would say it's two things. One is the regulatory format underpinning the seed system coming from government, and then the other part is essentially having a body that represents all parts of the seed industry where a consensus is forthcoming. As then a recommendation, for government to, if any change is required in regulation or seed law.
Last question, John. There's some countries where they have seed certification systems. In some cases, you have to only seed that is certified can be sold. Some systems like we have in Canada, some seed of some crops is certified, some is not. The United States, you mentioned there's no requirement for anything to be certified, and so there's many different ways of doing things. And in your opinion, is seed certification necessary for Canada? Is it a good thing? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll answer the question this way, which is to facilitate exports into certain importing countries, seed certification is a requirement. So some importers, that's a requirement that seed coming into our country requires that the seed is certified subject to, let's say, the OECD seed scheme. So to be in the export business, seed certification is a requirement. That's not to say that some countries, for some commodities, essentially do not require seed certification. They just require some type of quality assurance system that's required. So then looking at this from a Canadian point of view, then it comes to the question, so about 10% of our seed production is exported. So essentially, a large part of our seed production is for the domestic industry. So it raises the question of whether seed certification is required or a quality assurance system that essentially is satisfactory to the buying community, such as farmers. So I want to step back and say a quality assurance system is required, for the seed industry, because you don't know what's in a seed bag by just looking at it in terms of is this a replication of the breeder's seed, so that there has to be a quality assurance system with a label and what's on the labels in the bag. The question is whether the seed certification system that we have today is the right approach, or whether other quality assurance systems that are designed for satisfying the domestic market would be satisfactory on domestic sales, versus seed certification. So, for example, on the vegetable side around the world, it's more internal companies' quality assurance systems that are the driver, and not necessarily the seed certification system under the OECD seed scheme. So that's the way I would look at it in terms of, who's your end customer, what do they require, and then do you have a quality assurance program to meet those needs.